"One final question," he said, pausing in the doorway. "The first Mrs. Thornfield's death, it occurred near the anniversary of her marriage, did it not? Or perhaps near the anniversary of some other significant date?" The publican's face underwent a peculiar alteration, not quite fear, but something approaching shock at Whimsy's apparent omniscience. "It was on the anniversary," he said quietly, "of the day she arrived in the village. 3 years to the day she came here as a bride." "How very symbolic," Whimsy replied softly. "One might almost say deliberate. Thank you for your assistance. You have been remarkably forthcoming regarding matters that most would prefer to leave undisturbed." As Whimsy and Bunter returned to the motor car, the former found himself engaged in rapid mental calculation. Eleanor Marchmont had arrived in Thornfield Abbas as a bride, had experienced considerable distress during her residence, and had died precisely 3 years after that arrival. The timing suggested not accident, but rather a carefully orchestrated resolution to some crisis that had been developing throughout her marriage. Miss Ashford had preserved Eleanor's journal, a documentary record of whatever horror had precipitated Eleanor's destruction, and had maintained custody of that journal for more than 9 decades, waiting for an appropriate moment to ensure its revelation. That moment had apparently arrived when Miss Ashford became aware that Mr. Hartwell, who had been privy to certain legal secrets regarding the Thornfield family, was finding his conscience increasingly insupportable. Miss Ashford had moved to ensure that those secrets would not die with him, had arranged for the journal to reach Whimsy, and had thereby set in motion a chain of events that had led directly to her own demise. "Bunter," Whimsy said, as the motor car moved through the village streets, "I require access to the parish church records, birth registers, death records, marriage documentation, everything pertaining to the Thornfield family and the household of Eleanor Marchmont. Furthermore, I require the contents of Mr. Hartwell's client files, particularly any documentation regarding inheritance settlements or property disputes. And finally, I require an audience with Mrs. Hartwell. The widow, I suspect, possesses information that her husband deemed too dangerous to live with. Perhaps now that he is deceased, she may find herself more inclined toward revelation." "Very good, my lord," Bunter replied, his tone suggesting perfect understanding of the implications contained within these requests. The investigation, Whimsy reflected, was about to enter its most delicate phase. The truth was near now, trembling on the surface like a drowned thing about to break through water. And when it did surface, it would expose not merely a century-old tragedy, but the mechanisms by which that tragedy had been perpetuated, concealed, and ultimately avenged. The parish records, when finally procured through the Reverend's somewhat anxious cooperation, revealed a narrative that had been meticulously documented by successive clergymen, men who, Whimsy observed, appeared to have possessed considerably more curiosity regarding their parishioners' affairs than was strictly demanded by ecclesiastical duty. The marriage certificate of Richard Thornfield and Eleanor Marchmont, dated March 15, 1889, was accompanied by marginal annotations suggesting the vicar of that era had harbored considerable reservations regarding the union. The birth certificate of one Margaret Eleanor Thornfield, born February 3, 1890, was followed by a death certificate. Dated March 19, 1892, a child of merely 2 years, cause of death listed as infantile fever. "Fascinating," Whimsy murmured, running his finger along the entries with the precision of a man reading a particularly complex text. The child died in infancy, which would account for a certain species of marital discord. But observe the timing of Miss Eleanor's own distress as documented in the journal. The entries become increasingly agitated beginning in October of 1892, approximately 7 months after the child's death. One wonders what event occurring in that interim period precipitated such escalation of emotional anguish. The Reverend, who had been observing this examination with visible discomfort, ventured a hesitant observation. The child's death itself would have been sufficient cause for distress, surely. "The child's death would have occasioned sorrow, certainly," Whimsy replied, "but not the particular variety of moral horror that permeates the journal's later entries. No, something occurred subsequent to the infant's death, something that transformed Eleanor's distress from grief into what I can only describe as desperate horror. Something, moreover, that Eleanor believed herself capable of preventing through intervention. He set down the records and regarded the Reverend with sudden intensity. "Tell me, was there any subsequent child born to Richard Thornfield and Eleanor?" The Reverend consulted the records with increasing agitation. No subsequent children. Eleanor died in March of 1894. No further pregnancies are documented. How very telling, Whimsy observed. The first child died in infancy. No subsequent children were conceived, though the marriage continued for nearly 2 additional years. One might speculate that Eleanor, having lost one child in fear, the conception of another, had taken deliberate measures to prevent pregnancy. Or, alternatively, that Richard Thornfield, having lost his heir, had elected to maintain his distance from his wife's bed. Either circumstance would suggest considerable marital discord, but neither fully explains the intensity of the journal entries. Whimsy rose and began to pace the small vestry where the records had been made available, his expression suggesting internal calculation of considerable complexity. The journal mentions the visitor with increasing frequency beginning in October of 1892. References to this individual are veiled, but the emotional tone escalates from curiosity to concern to outright horror. Eleanor fears that this visitor will corrupt someone she cares for. She expresses terror that revelation of certain facts would destroy an innocent party, and finally in her last entries she indicates her determination to act, though the cost to her own soul be damnation. He paused in his pacing and turned sharply to face the Reverend. "Who was the visitor, Reverend? That is the question that will unlock everything else." "I could not possibly know," the Reverend protested. "No, but the records might," Whimsy replied, returning his attention to the parish documentation. He began to examine the entries with renewed intensity, his fingers moving rapidly through the accumulated pages. Then, abruptly, he stopped. Here, an entry from January of 1892, some 9 months prior to the child's death. The notation reads, "RT engaged in household staff alterations. New position created. Residence provided." And then, immediately following, another entry in what appears to be a different hand, much less refined. "Engaged as under gardener at Manor House. Position most satisfactory." I fail to see the significance. The Reverend offered uncertainly. "Of course you do," Whimsy replied, not unkindly, "because you are examining the document as a historical record rather than as a narrative. But observe, a new position was created in January of 1892. Someone was hired as an under-gardener. Someone, moreover, who apparently possessed the literacy required to make entries in a parish record, though his position was of a decidedly humble nature. And then, precisely 1 month later, a child was born. A child who, according to the birth certificate, was legitimately the offspring of Richard and Eleanor Thornfield. But was she? The implications of this suggestion hung in the air of the small vestry like an accusation made flesh. The Reverend's face underwent a remarkable transformation, from confusion to dawning comprehension to something approaching profound distress. "You cannot possibly suggest—" "I suggest nothing," Whimsy interrupted gently. "I merely observe that the timing is curious. I observe that Eleanor's distress intensified when she apparently became aware of, or was forced to confront, some truth regarding the child's parentage. I observe that the mysterious visitor who arrived in October of 1892 occasioned Eleanor's most frantic entries, and I observe that Eleanor, facing some crisis that threatened to expose this truth and thereby destroy an innocent party, chose to remove herself permanently from the equation. But if that were the case," the Reverend protested, "why would the current Mrs. Thornfield have any interest in suppressing the information? It occurred more than a century ago. The principals are all deceased." "An excellent question," Whimsy acknowledged, "which suggests that the matter extends considerably beyond a mere historical scandal. No, the current Mrs. Thornfield's anxiety regarding the revelation of these facts stems from something far more contemporary. She visited Miss Ashford in the days preceding the Reverend's receipt of my telegram. She departed in considerable agitation, and subsequently both Miss Ashford and Mr. Hartwell, who presumably knew or suspected the truth regarding the journal's contents, found themselves confronting circumstances that led to their deaths. He turned to face the Reverend with an expression of quiet certainty. The question before us is not what occurred in 1892, but rather what occurs now as a result of that distant tragedy. Mrs. Thornfield murdered Miss Ashford. Of that I am increasingly confident. The question that remains is whether she did so as a final act of self-preservation, or whether she acted upon the instigation of someone else, someone who stands to benefit from the permanent suppression of Eleanor Marchmont's confession. The interview with Mrs. Hartwell occurred in the modest cottage that had become her refuge following her husband's death, a place that bore all the hallmarks of a woman engaged in the difficult process of learning to exist alone. She received Whimsy in a sitting room that smelled of lavender sachets and old furniture, her posture suggesting both reluctance and resignation in equal measure. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with the sort of appearance that suggested she had once been pretty and had gradually adjusted to the loss of that particular advantage, without bitterness, merely with acceptance. "The constabulary informed me that the matter was concluded," she said, her voice lacking inflection, "that my husband's death was determined to be suicide. I was told that no further investigation would occur." "The constabulary," Whimsy replied gently, "are frequently compelled to reach conclusions on the basis of insufficient information. I am not constrained by such limb. I am, however, constrained by an obligation to truth. Your husband left a note indicating that he could not bear the weight of certain confidences. I suspect you know what those confidences were. Furthermore, I suspect you know that your husband's death was not entirely voluntary." Mrs. Hartwell's composure underwent a subtle but unmistakable alteration. Her hands, which had been folded carefully in her lap, began to tremble with a tremor she appeared unable to suppress. "I cannot speak to such matters," she whispered. "You can," Whimsy replied, his tone remaining patient but carrying an undertone of inexorable purpose, "and I suspect you must. Mr. Hartwell's death occurred 3 weeks ago. Miss Ashford died 6 weeks ago. Both deaths were sudden and, on the surface, entirely natural or self-inflicted. Yet both were precipitated by the possession of dangerous knowledge regarding events that occurred more than 90 years in the past. I require you to explain the mechanism by which a century-old tragedy continues to exercise such lethal influence upon the present." Mrs. Hartwell rose abruptly and moved to the window, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed upon something apparently invisible to external observers. "My husband," she said slowly, "was a man of considerable conscience. It was one of the qualities that attracted me to him during our courtship. He possessed a genuine commitment to justice and propriety. This commitment made him an excellent solicitor, but a deeply unhappy man, for Thornfield Abbas contains numerous injustices that have been permitted to fester beneath the surface of respectability." Specifically, Whimsy prompted. "The Thornfield family," Mrs. Hartwell continued, "has engaged in a conspiracy of silence spanning more than a century. My husband discovered this conspiracy quite by accident while examining certain property documentation regarding the transfer of the manor house following Richard Thornfield's death. He found references to a trust fund, a substantial trust fund, established in the name of one Margaret Eleanor Thornfield, with instructions that the fund remain inaccessible until such time as the truth regarding the child's parentage be disclosed in writing to an authorized representative of the family." "How very intriguing," Whimsy observed. "A trust fund established as an incentive for disclosure. One wonders who established such an unusual arrangement." "Eleanor Marchmont's father," Mrs. Hartwell said, "a man of considerable wealth and considerable pride. He apparently sensed that something was amiss regarding his daughter's marriage, but lacked sufficient evidence to act decisively. Instead, he created a mechanism by which the truth, whatever that truth might be, would eventually be forced into the open. But he apparently underestimated the determination of the Thornfield family to maintain their secrets." "And what was the truth?" Whimsy inquired. Mrs. Hartwell turned from the window, and her face bore an expression suggesting she had made some internal resolution of considerable significance. Margaret Eleanor Thornfield was not the biological child of Richard and Eleanor Thornfield. She was the illegitimate daughter of Eleanor and a man employed on the estate, the under-gardener engaged in January of 1892. Eleanor, who had been unable to conceive during her first years of marriage, had apparently developed an intimate relationship with this man. When she became pregnant, Richard Thornfield agreed to acknowledge the child as his own in exchange for Eleanor's silence and the man's immediate dismissal from the estate, a solution of considerable pragmatism, Whimsy observed, but also considerable cruelty. The child would grow to adulthood believing herself to be the legitimate daughter of Richard Thornfield, never knowing her true paternity. Eleanor would maintain her position while harboring the knowledge of her deception, and Richard would possess an air of questionable legitimacy. The instability inherent in such an arrangement must have been extraordinary. It was, Mrs. Hartwell confirmed. When the child died at age 2, apparently from infantile fever, Eleanor apparently became convinced that her deception had brought divine punishment. She developed increasingly severe emotional disturbance, which my husband's research suggests may have included what contemporary physicians would describe as psychotic episodes. She began attempting to confess the truth to various parties, but was consistently prevented from doing so by Richard, who threatened her with institutionalization if she persisted, and thus we arrive at the journal, Whimsy said. Eleanor's frantic documentation of her despair, her attempts to confess, her terror regarding the consequences of her actions. Yes, Mrs. Hartwell replied. Eleanor appears to have intended the journal as a confession, a final record of her sin and her suffering. My husband found documentation suggesting that Eleanor gave the journal to her companion, Miss Ashford's predecessor, with instructions that it be preserved and eventually revealed to someone capable of understanding its significance. When that companion eventually departed the household, she apparently entrusted the journal to the young Miss Ashford with similar instructions. And Mr. Hartwell discovered this history while examining the trust documentation, Whimsy continued. He realized that the trust fund, presumably substantial by any standard, remained unclaimed because the condition for its release required written disclosure of the truth. He consulted with Miss Ashford, who possessed the journal and understood its significance. Together, they apparently decided that the truth should finally be revealed, thereby allowing the trust fund to fulfill its intended purpose. My husband attempted to contact Mrs. Thornfield, Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. He informed her that he possessed knowledge of the family secret and that he intended to facilitate the trust fund's release unless she could provide compelling reasons for continued suppression. He believed, naively as it transpired, that she would be relieved by the disclosure, that she would welcome the opportunity to finally end the deception. But she did not, Whimsy observed softly. She did not, Mrs. Hartwell confirmed. Instead, she apparently visited Miss Ashford and threatened her with consequences if the journal were revealed. Miss Ashford, who was in poor health, apparently suffered a severe cardiac event during this confrontation. Mrs. Thornfield, whether deliberately or through panic, made no attempt to summon medical assistance. Miss Ashford died within hours, and Mr. Hartwell learned of Miss Ashford's death and apparently concluded that his own disclosure of the family secret would result in additional deaths. He became convinced that revealing the truth would bring only harm to innocent parties. He wrote his note and... Mrs. Hartwell's voice became entirely inaudible, and he took his own life. Whimsy absorbed this information in silence, his expression suggesting the process of final deduction occurring beneath his carefully maintained composure. "Where," he asked finally, "is the trust fund now?" "Dormant," Mrs. Hartwell replied. "Unclaimed. Approximately £200,000, accrued with interest over more than a century. The funds remain locked in a legal instrument that only the Thornfield family solicitor, which is now technically no one, following my husband's death, can release, provided they can demonstrate that the condition of disclosure has been satisfied. £200,000, Whimsy repeated softly, a considerable sum. Sufficient, one might imagine, to justify extraordinary measures to prevent its release, particularly if the current Mrs. Thornfield's financial position is considerably less secure than appearances suggest. He rose from his chair and moved toward the door, then paused. "Mrs. Hartwell, I require one final piece of information. The under-gardener who fathered Margaret Eleanor. Do you know what became of him?" "My husband's research suggested," Mrs. Hartwell replied, "that he was dismissed from the estate and subsequently emigrated to America, but there were records indicating that he maintained occasional correspondence with Miss Ashford's predecessor, Eleanor's companion. Letters suggesting that he remained aware of his daughter's existence, though he maintained his distance and never attempted contact." "How very human," Whimsy observed. "To possess a child and yet refrain from claiming her, all out of respect for the woman he loved and the life she had chosen." The under-gardener possessed more integrity than any member of the Thornfield family has demonstrated. He departed the cottage with his mind apparently engaged in final calculations, leaving Mrs. Hartwell to her solitary grief and the knowledge that her husband's death, like Miss Ashford's, had been precipitated by the attempt to resurrect a truth that had been deliberately buried for more than a century. The constabulary office of Thornfield Abbas occupied a small stone building adjacent to the village hall, a structure that appeared to have been constructed during an era when law enforcement required considerably less accommodation than modern practice demanded. Constable Graves, a man of perhaps 45 with the cautious D, a manner of one who had learned that excessive initiative frequently resulted in complications, received Whimsy with the wariness of a subordinate officer confronted by authority he neither understood nor particularly welcomed. "I have examined Mr. Hartwell's death," Whimsy said, settling himself in a chair that creaked ominously beneath his weight, "and I find myself possessed of certain observations regarding the official conclusion. Specifically, I find the conclusion inadequate. The revolver found beside Mr. Hartwell bears your fingerprints, I presume, from your examination of the scene?" "Standard procedure," Graves replied defensively. "Any constable would have handled the weapon during investigation." "Naturally," Whimsy agreed. "But I should like to examine the weapon now, if you would be so kind, and I should like to observe the suicide note with considerably greater attention than it apparently received during your initial inquiry." Graves retrieved both items with visible reluctance. The revolver was a serviceable Webley, of the sort commonly employed by gentlemen of Hartwell's generation, its mechanism showing signs of careful maintenance. The suicide note, written upon Hartwell's personal stationery, bore the exact phrasing Whimsy had previously observed, a confession of inability to bear the weight of confidences, but no specifics regarding the nature of those confidences or the identity of their keeper. "Observe," Whimsy said, examining the note through a small magnifying glass he had produced from his pocket. "The handwriting exhibits signs of tremor and emotional disturbance, which is consistent with a man in extreme psychological anguish. However, observe also the consistency of the line weight, the regularity of the letter formation despite the overall disturbance. A man on the verge of suicide frequently exhibits considerably more erratic writing. Foo. Rothermore, the pressure of the pen is inconsistent, pressing heavily at certain points, then diminishing abruptly. This pattern suggests the writer was interrupted during composition, then resumed writing after a brief interval." "What of it?" Graves inquired, apparently failing to perceive the significance of these observations. "What of it?" Whimsy repeated, "is that a man contemplating suicide writes with a certain finality. His penmanship does not improve midway through the composition. Yet this note shows distinct improvement in the latter portion. The final sentence, 'I pray for forgiveness,' is written with considerably greater control than the initial sentences. This suggests that Mr. Hartwell did not compose this note in a single sitting while in a state of active suicidal ideation. Rather, it appears to have been written over an extended period, possibly revised, possibly even interrupted by the intrusion of external parties." Graves' face underwent a subtle alteration suggesting the beginning of comprehension, though his expression remained skeptical. "You are suggesting the note is not entirely genuine. I am suggesting, Whimsy replied carefully, that the note may have been substantially altered following Mr. Hartwell's death. The final portion, in particular, bears signs of having been appended by a different hand attempting to replicate Mr. Hartwell's script. Note the slight variations in slope, the inconsistency in letter spacing, the marginally altered pressure. A forgery would be crude and obvious. This, however, is something considerably more sophisticated, an augmentation rather than a fabrication, undertaken by someone possessing intimate knowledge of Mr. Hartwell's habitual penmanship, but who would, Graves began, then paused as comprehension apparently reached completion. Mrs. Thornfield, Whimsy confirmed, who visited Mr. Hartwell on the evening of his death, apparently to discuss his determination to facilitate the disclosure of the family secret. During that visit, something occurred that resulted in Mr. Hartwell's death, whether deliberately precipitated or opportunistically seized upon remains to be determined. Subsequently, Mrs. Thornfield altered the suicide note to remove any reference to the specific circumstances that had motivated Mr. Hartwell's despair. She added the final pious sentiment to render the note less suspicious, more readily consistent with simple emotional breakdown rather than knowledge of particular secrets. This is speculation, Graves protested, but his tone suggested diminishing confidence in his original conclusions. It is deduction, Whimsy corrected, supported by physical evidence and logical analysis. But corroboration can be obtained readily enough. I require you to conduct an examination of the revolver's firing mechanism. Specifically, I require you to determine whether the weapon could have been fired by a man in the psychological state Mr. Hartwell was apparently experiencing at the time of his death. Additionally, I require an examination of the room in which Mr. Hartwell was discovered, specifically the spatial relationship between the chair, the body, and the location where the revolver was found. And finally, I require knowledge of whether any alternative witnesses observed Mrs. Thornfield's arrival at or departure from Mr. Hartwell's residence on the evening in question. Graves rose with the air of a man whose comfortable conclusions had been rendered substantially less comfortable by external intervention. I shall make the inquiries, but I must inform you that if you intend to make accusations against Mrs. Thornfield, you will require considerably more substantial evidence than textual analysis of a suicide note. I am aware, Whimsy replied, that the legal requirements for prosecution are considerably more rigorous than the requirements for private investigation. However, I suspect that once certain inquiries are concluded, the evidence will prove sufficiently substantial to satisfy even the Crown Prosecution Service. In the interim, I should like to examine Mr. Hartwell's office, specifically his client files and his personal correspondence. Surely you retain such documentation for evidentiary purposes? Graves conducted him to a back office where Mr. Hartwell's effects had been stored pending the final settlement of his estate. The files proved to be meticulously organized, alphabetically arranged by client name, color-coded by matter type, annotated with careful notations regarding progress and outstanding issues. Whimsy proceeded through them with methodical precision, his attention eventually arrested by a file labeled Thornfield, Trust Fund Matter. The contents were remarkably comprehensive, decades of documentation regarding the trust fund's establishment, its terms, its conditions for release. There were letters from lawyers in London, correspondence with the bank holding the funds, and most significantly, a detailed memorandum in Mr. Hartwell's own hand documenting his discovery of the secret and his subsequent conversation with Miss Ashford regarding the journal's contents. Constable Graves, Whimsy said, not looking up from the file, I require that you contact Scotland Yard and request the dispatch of a forensic investigator. Specifically, I require someone capable of providing expert testimony regarding the analysis of document alterations. Additionally, I require that you place Mrs. Thornfield under discreet observation. Should she attempt to depart the village, she is to be detained pending further investigation. On what grounds? Graves demanded. You cannot detain someone without, on the grounds that she is a material witness to events pertaining to 2 deaths currently under investigation, Whimsy replied coolly. unless you prefer to wait until she has successfully fled the country, in which case the Crown Prosecution Service may ask why the constabulary of Thornfield Abbas elected to permit the departure of an individual upon whom suspicion had fallen. Graves departed to conduct the necessary communications, leaving Wimsey alone with Mr. Hartwell's files. The investigation, Wimsey reflected, had reached the point of divergence, the moment when the careful orchestration of secret-keeping finally fragmented beneath the weight of accumulated truth. Mrs. Thornfield would recognize that her position had become untenable. She would understand that silence was no longer an option, that revelation was inevitable, and she would, if the pattern held true, attempt to ensure that she could not be implicated in the deaths that had resulted from her determination to maintain the family's carefully constructed deception. The confrontation, Wimsey knew, would not be extended. Mrs. Thornfield was a woman of considerable intelligence and equally considerable desperation, a combination that frequently resulted in unexpected resolutions of considerable finality. The telegram arrived at the rectory at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, its contents suggesting a degree of urgency that warranted immediate action. Mrs. Thornfield, it appeared, had made an attempt to withdraw a substantial sum from her bank account and had subsequently departed her residence in the direction of the railway station. Constable Graves, upon receiving instructions from Wimsey via telephone, had proceeded to intercept her, though whether such interception would prove successful remained a matter of some uncertainty. Wimsey received this intelligence with the expression of a man who had anticipated precisely such a development and was merely observing the confirmation of his predictions with mild satisfaction. "Bunter," he said, rising from the settee where he had been engaged in apparently idle contemplation, "I require the motor car. We shall proceed to the railway station with expedience. Mrs. Thornfield has made her final mistake. She has chosen flight rather than confrontation, thereby forfeiting whatever sympathy her desperation might otherwise have generated. The railway station of Thornfield Abbas was a modest structure of Victorian construction, its platforms designed to accommodate perhaps a dozen passengers during periods of maximum occupancy. Constable Graves stood upon the principal platform, his expression suggesting considerable uncertainty regarding the appropriateness of his actions, while Mrs. Thornfield occupied a bench some 20 feet distant, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed upon the railway tracks with the intensity of a woman contemplating matters of profound consequence. "Mrs. Thornfield," Wimsey said, his tone employing that particular combination of courtesy and inexorability that had proven effective in numerous previous confrontations, "I believe we have several matters to discuss. The constable here has been instructed not to permit your departure, and I suspect that you have recognized the futility of attempting flight. Therefore, I propose that we retire to a location of greater privacy, the rectory perhaps, where we might conduct a conversation of considerable significance without the distraction of railway schedules and the inevitable interruption of curious onlookers." Mrs. Thornfield rose slowly, her movements suggesting either profound weariness or the acceptance of an inevitable conclusion. "You believe you have discovered the truth," she said, her voice lacking inflection. "You believe that I murdered Eleanor Ashford and that I conspired in the death of James Hartwell. You possess insufficient evidence to prove such allegations, but you hope that confrontation and accusation will compel confession." "Not entirely," Wimsey replied gently. "I have discovered considerably more than mere suspicions, but I confess that I prefer to discuss such matters in circumstances that permit extended conversation, rather than within the confines of railway platforms. Shall we proceed?" The Reverend's drawing-room had been prepared for the purpose. A fire lit despite the autumn mildness, tea arranged upon a side table, chairs positioned to facilitate both conversation and observation. Wimsey settled himself with the air of a man preparing for a discussion of considerable delicacy, while Bunter maintained his customary station near the doorway, a silent but attentive witness to the proceedings. "Eleanor Marchmont," Wimsey began, his tone suggesting he was merely organizing thoughts aloud, was a woman of considerable emotional sensitivity who found herself trapped within a marriage founded upon deception. She had conceived a child through an illicit relationship with an estate employee, and her husband had agreed to acknowledge that child as legitimate in exchange for her silence. When the child died, a tragedy that Eleanor apparently interpreted as divine punishment for her sin, she experienced what contemporary physicians would have recognized as severe psychological disturbance. She attempted repeatedly to confess her transgression, but was prevented from doing so by Richard Thornfield, who threatened her with institutionalization if she persisted. Finally, recognizing that confession was impossible and that her psychological distress was becoming increasingly insupportable, Eleanor chose to remove herself permanently from the equation. She entrusted her journal to her companion, Miss Ashford's predecessor, with instructions that the truth eventually be revealed. Mrs. Thornfield listened to this recitation with apparent composure, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor. "This is history," she said quietly. "Ancient history. It possesses no relevance to the present. On the contrary," Whimsy continued, "it possesses considerable relevance. Eleanor's father, a man of considerable foresight, had established a trust fund with a most unusual condition. The funds would remain inaccessible unless and until someone could provide written disclosure of the truth regarding Margaret Eleanor's parentage. For more than a century, that trust fund accumulated interest, growing from its original substantial sum into something approaching £200,000. For more than a century, the Thornfield family labored under the knowledge that this considerable fortune existed but remained inaccessible, provided only that the family secret was maintained. And then," Whimsy said, his tone sharpening, "Mr. Hartwell, while examining property documentation following your husband's death, discovered the existence of this trust fund and its conditions for release. He contacted Miss Ashford, who possessed Eleanor's journal. Together, they apparently reached the conclusion that the truth should finally be revealed, thereby allowing the trust fund to fulfill its intended purpose. Mr. Hartwell informed you of his intentions, expecting that you would welcome the opportunity to end a century of secrecy. Instead," Mrs. Thornfield said, her voice becoming barely audible, "I visited him and explained that the revelation would constitute a catastrophic embarrassment to the family name. I attempted to convince him that silence remained preferable to disclosure, but he refused. He informed me that his conscience would not permit continued complicity in the suppression of truth. We argued. And then," she paused, her composure apparently fragmenting, "and then he appeared to suffer some sort of cardiac episode. He was gasping for breath, clutching at his chest. I panicked. I feared that if I summoned assistance he would survive and would reveal what we had discussed. I did not call for help. You did more than that," Whimsy replied quietly. "You altered his suicide note. You added pious sentiments designed to deflect suspicion from the specific circumstances that had motivated his despair. And subsequently, when Miss Ashford proved unwilling to maintain silence regarding the journal's existence, you visited her and threatened her with consequences if she persisted in her intention to facilitate disclosure. The shock of your threat, combined with her advanced age and her cardiac fragility, resulted in her death. I did not murder her," Mrs. Thornfield said, her voice becoming almost desperate. I merely informed her that revelation of the family secret would result in scandal. I did not intend. I could not have anticipated." "And yet," Whimsy observed, "two people who possessed knowledge of that secret are now deceased, and a third, yourself, stands accused of their deaths. The question that remains is whether these deaths were accomplished through deliberate action or through the exploitation of circumstance. I suspect the latter, which mitigates neither the moral culpability nor the legal consequences, but which may prove relevant during proceedings." "Why?" Mrs. Thornfield asked, her composure finally entirely abandoned. "Why have you pursued this matter so relentlessly? What possible benefit accrues from exposing a century-old scandal?" "Because truth," Whimsy replied, "possesses an extraordinary capacity to demand justice, regardless of the centuries that intervene between transgression and revelation. Because Eleanor Marchmont, despite her weakness and her desperation, deserves to have her suffering acknowledged. and because Mr. Hartwell and Miss Ashford, who attempted to rectify a profound historical injustice, deserve to have their deaths treated as something more than convenient conclusions to inconvenient investigations. He rose from his chair and moved toward the window, where the autumn light was beginning its inevitable decline. "Constable Graves," he continued, addressing the officer who had entered during the latter portion of the conversation, "I believe you now possess sufficient evidence to charge Mrs. Thornfield with conspiracy in the deaths of James Hartwell and Eleanor Ashford. The specific charges may be refined following consultation with the Crown Prosecution Service, but the essential facts remain established." As Graves conducted Mrs. Thornfield from the room, Wimsey turned to regard the Reverend with an expression of quiet satisfaction tempered by profound melancholy. "The trust fund," he said, "will presumably now pass to distant relatives of Eleanor Marchmont, thereby fulfilling her father's intention that the truth be rewarded with financial restitution. Miss Ashford, who maintained Eleanor's confidence for more than a century, will be remembered as something other than merely a village librarian, and Mr. Hartwell, whose conscience could not accommodate continued silence, will be recognized as a man of genuine integrity. And Mrs. Thornfield?" the Reverend inquired softly. "Mrs. Thornfield," Wimsey replied, "will face the consequences of her actions, not because she is fundamentally evil, but because she chose protection of family reputation over the demands of truth and conscience. In the end, she destroyed far more through her silence than she could possibly have preserved through revelation." The investigation thus concluded left behind the peculiar emptiness that follows upon the resolution of complex mysteries, a sense that something significant has been concluded, yet something equally significant has been irrevocably lost. Wimsey departed Thornfield Abbas the following morning, leaving behind him a village forced to confront truths it had spent more than a century concealing. Edmund certainly wouldn't have revealed such incriminating information. The servants knew nothing, which leaves, by process of elimination, only one person who could have served as the conduit for this vital piece of information. "You're mistaken," Marjorie said, but her voice had become strained, almost pleading. "I knew nothing about any of this." "I don't doubt that you knew nothing about the original plan," Wimsey continued, moving around the desk with the measured pace of a man constructing an argument with considerable care. "However, I suspect that on Monday evening, whilst your husband was still alive, and Christopher was still attempting to determine how best to utilize the opportunity that Edmund had so conveniently provided, Christopher came to you with a proposition. He offered you something, money, perhaps, or the assurance of your comfort should anything unfortunate occur to him. In exchange, he requested that you provide him with certain crucial information regarding Edmund's plans." Marjorie's silence was itself an admission, more eloquent than any verbal confession could have been. Her eyes had grown distant, and her hands had begun to tremble in her lap with a subtlety that suggested the psychological scaffolding upon which she had constructed. Her behavior was beginning to collapse. "You drugged yourself," Wimsey said with quiet certainty. "Some mild sedative, perhaps, nothing that would prove fatal or even particularly noticeable, but sufficient to ensure that you would be genuinely asleep when your stepson completed his murder. You thereby provided yourself with an alibi of unquestionable solidity, whilst simultaneously demonstrating to Christopher that you were willing to participate in his scheme. He believed, or at least he allowed himself to believe, that you were an accomplice in his crime." "I didn't know," Marjorie whispered, her voice scarcely audible. "I didn't understand what he was asking me to do. He said only that there was an opportunity to secure Edmund's guilt, that I need only remain unconscious through the evening. I thought he meant to stage some false evidence, something that could be explained away later. I didn't know he actually intended to complete his father's murder." Wimsey finished for her. "No, I suspect you didn't, which raises the rather vexing question of what your culpability might be deemed to consist of. You participated, however unwittingly, in a conspiracy to frame your stepson for a capital crime. You accepted, whether explicitly or implicitly, a degree of responsibility for actions whose full extent you did not comprehend. That is, I think, considerably more than mere innocence, but considerably less than deliberate murder." Superintendent Hutchins entered the study at that precise moment, his expression indicating that he had been observing the proceedings from the adjoining room. "We'll need a formal statement from her," he said to Whimsy, his tone suggesting that whilst he did not particularly relish the proceedings, he understood their necessity. Whatever her degree of complicity, she's a material witness at minimum. Whimsy nodded, and Marjorie rose to her feet with the movements of a woman suddenly aged by several decades. The November afternoon had begun its inexorable descent into evening by the time Whimsy and Superintendent Hutchins convened in the drawing-room for what Hutchins had termed, with characteristic understatement, a final accounting. The constables had departed with their prisoners, Christopher in custody pending trial for murder, Marjorie under a form of loose surveillance pending. Determination of her precise legal status, and the household had settled into that particular quality of silence that follows immediately upon the removal of tension. It was not a peaceful silence, but rather the silence of held breath, the silence of people waiting for the other shoe to descend with inevitable finality. Hutchins had positioned himself before the fireplace, a position that suggested he was both physically and emotionally exhausted by the proceedings thus far undertaken. He accepted a brandy from Whimsy's careful hand, with the gratitude of a man who had learned not to ask questions regarding the provenance of such generous offerings. "I confess," Hutchins began, after taking a restorative sip of his drink, "that I am still endeavoring to comprehend the full architecture of this affair. Christopher murdered his father in order to secure an inheritance he believed Edmund had compromised. Edmund attempted the murder but lacked sufficient moral fortitude to complete the act. And Marjorie, through a combination of naivete and desire for financial security, provided her stepson with the crucial information regarding Edmund's intentions that allowed him to complete the crime. A rather neat summary," Whimsy observed, settling himself into a chair with the careful precision of a man whose bones had begun to register the cumulative effects of extensive exertion. "Though I suspect the underlying psychological architecture is considerably more complex than even that rather comprehensive summary suggests. Enlighten me," Hutchins requested, his tone suggesting that whilst he was exhausted, he remained sufficiently invested in the matter to appreciate additional illumination. "The crooked spoon," Whimsy began, gesturing absently with his drink, "was the crucial element that transformed what might have been a straightforward, if sordid case of attempted murder into something considerably more elaborate. Edmund bent that spoon with full knowledge and intent. It was not an accident born of carelessness or desperation, but rather a deliberate act undertaken by a man who had already begun to construct a narrative in which his guilt would be inextricably established. The bent spoon was, in essence, Edmund's confession made physical, a tangible representation of his intention to murder his father." "Yes, yes," Hutchins said with the impatience of a man who had already grasped these essential elements. "We've established that. What I'm attempting to understand is the psychological impulse that motivated Christopher to utilize Edmund's failed attempt as a mechanism for completing the murder himself." Whimsy rose and moved to the window, gazing out upon the darkening landscape with an expression of considerable contemplation. When he spoke, his voice had acquired a peculiar quality, not quite detachment, but rather a kind of sorrowful understanding that suggested he had begun to comprehend something profoundly human in the sordid mechanics of Christopher's motivation. "Christopher's entire existence has been predicated upon the achievement of external validation," Whimsy explained. "He has built himself into a figure of financial success, of demonstrated capability, of undeniable accomplishment. Yet none of this achievement has produced the one thing he has genuinely desired, his father's recognition and approval. Edmund, despite his manifest failures, retained that approval simply by virtue of being the object of Victor's paternal hopes and expectations. When Victor altered his will in Christopher's favor, it seemed for a brief moment that the recognition Christopher had sought for decades was finally within his grasp. And then Edmund threatened to compromise it," Hutchins interjected, beginning to understand the psychological trajectory. "Ori, precisely so," Whimsy confirmed. When Christopher discovered that his father was considering returning to the original will in Edmund's favor, he faced a choice between accepting that his achievements were ultimately insufficient to merit paternal love, or taking action to ensure that Edmund could no longer compete for that love. Christopher chose the latter course. But observe what is truly remarkable. He did not poison his father out of genuine malice toward Edmund, nor out of pure financial self-interest. He poisoned his father because Edmund's existence represented a permanent, irrefutable negation of Christopher's worth. Hutchins contemplated this assessment whilst sipping his brandy with the deliberate concentration of a man attempting to process information that contradicted his fundamental assumptions regarding human motivation. "You're suggesting that Christopher murdered his father as a way of murdering his brother?" "Not precisely," Wimsey corrected. "I'm suggesting that Christopher murdered his father as a way of proving his own superiority to Edmund. By allowing Edmund to take the blame for a murder that Christopher himself had completed, he would simultaneously demonstrate both Edmund's moral degeneracy and his own superior intellect. The irony, of course, is that in attempting to prove his superiority through the commission of murder, Christopher has merely revealed that he and Edmund are substantially more similar than either of them would have cared to admit." "What of Edmund himself?" Hutchins asked. "He placed the arsenic in the first instance. He bent the spoon with intent to kill. How does one categorize his culpability?" "That," Wimsey said, returning to his seat, "is precisely the question that will occupy the courts for considerably longer than I suspect anyone will find comfortable. Edmund attempted murder but renounced the act before its completion. He did not, in the final analysis, kill his father. Yet his actions facilitated Christopher's murder through the provision of both motive and method. The law will struggle with that distinction, I think. As well it might, for the distinction itself is profoundly human and profoundly difficult." "Will he hang?" Hutchins asked bluntly. "Christopher?" "Almost certainly. The evidence is overwhelming, and his own reaction to exposure suggests he will offer minimal resistance to the proceedings." "Edmund?" Wimsey paused, considering. "That depends upon the benevolence of juries and judges, neither of which have historically been noted for their excessive generosity toward the perpetrators of attempted patricide. But I suspect that Edmund's crime, in the final accounting, will be deemed sufficiently attenuated by his ultimate renunciation to permit some form of mitigation. The law is, after all, a human construct, and humans are occasionally capable of recognizing that circumstances matter." The formal conclusion of the investigation proceeded with the measured solemnity of a funeral service, which was perhaps appropriate given that Victor Ashford's actual funeral remained pending the completion of the legal machinery that murder inevitably sets in motion. Wimsey found himself, by the late evening of the following day, in Superintendent Hutchins' temporary office at the Sussex Constabulary headquarters, a space notable primarily for its comprehensive lack of aesthetic appeal and its extraordinary abundance of paperwork documenting the various statements, evidence, and observations that had been accumulated during the course of the investigation. "The Crown Prosecutor has reviewed the evidence," Hutchins announced, entering the office with 2 cups of exceedingly poor tea and settling himself behind his desk with the air of a man preparing to deliver pronouncement. "Of considerable consequence. His assessment is that Christopher Ashford should be charged with murder, as anticipated. The case against him is, in his estimation, ironclad. The arsenic residue upon his hands, combined with his own implicit admission of knowledge regarding Edmund's failed attempt, provides sufficient foundation for both motive and action." "And Edmund?" Wimsey inquired, accepting one of the cups with a courteous nod that did nothing to disguise his evident distaste for its contents. "That's where matters become considerably more delicate," Hutchins replied, setting down his own cup with the care of a man handling something actively hazardous. "The prosecutor is inclined toward charging him with attempted murder, as you anticipated. However, the Home Office has indicated that given Edmund's renunciation of the act before its completion, there may be grounds for considering a reduced charge of conspiracy to commit murder, or possibly even simple possession of arsenic with intent to cause bodily harm. The question hinges entirely upon whether the court views Edmund's abandonment of the poisoning as a genuine renunciation of criminal intent or merely a postponement occasioned by cowardice." Wimsey set aside his own cup with evident relief, having taken only the briefest of sips. The courts will, as they so often do, construct elaborate logical frameworks around what is essentially a question of moral philosophy. Was Edmund's renunciation genuine, born of conscience? Or was it merely the temporary failure of nerve that precedes ultimate action? The law demands certainty, but the human soul traffics primarily in ambiguity. "You sound," Hutchins observed with the faintest suggestion of a smile, almost sympathetic to Edmund Ashford's plight. Sympathetic. Wimsey contemplated the word as though it were a particularly complex legal concept requiring care. Full examination. I should not characterize my assessment as sympathy precisely. Rather, I would suggest that Edmund Ashford is a man who has spent his entire existence inhabiting the shadow cast by his younger brother's success and his father's disappointed expectations. He attempted to murder his father not out of genuine malice, but out of a desperate desire to transform his circumstances through a single irrevocable action. That he lacked the fortitude to complete that action is arguably more a reflection of his essential humanity than of any profound moral superiority. "And Christopher?" Hutchins pressed. "Do you extend similar philosophical understanding to the man who actually completed the murder?" "Christopher," Wimsey said slowly, rising and moving once again toward the window, a habit that seemed to have established itself over the course of the investigation, "is a considerably more troubling case. Christopher is, in many respects, the embodiment of what modern society celebrates: the self-made man, the individual who has achieved success through sheer determination and rational calculation. Yet that very rationality, that very capacity to marshal resources and construct elaborate plans, is precisely what permitted him to recognize in Edmund's failed attempt an opportunity for the completion of his own design. Christopher did not murder his father in a moment of passion or desperation. He murdered his father as a logical consequence of a carefully constructed argument regarding the allocation of resources and the distribution of paternal affection. Hutchins had begun arranging papers on his desk with the methodical precision of a man requiring some physical activity to accompany intellectual contemplation. "The legal proceedings will commence within a fortnight, I expect. The trial will likely prove extensive. There are considerable complexities regarding the evidence, and Christopher's brief will undoubtedly attempt to establish some form of diminished responsibility or psychological impairment. They will fail in that endeavor," Wimsey predicted with quiet certainty. "Christopher Ashford is profoundly sane. That is, in fact, what makes him so profoundly disturbing. His crime was not the product of madness or overwhelming emotion, but of calculation and logic applied toward the pursuit of personal advantage. He saw an opportunity and seized it. The tragedy is that he did not perceive, or perhaps he perceived but did not care, that in doing so he was destroying not merely his father, but also his own possibility of ever achieving the genuine paternal recognition he so desperately desired." "You believe he understands that?" Hutchins asked. "I believe," Wimsey replied, turning from the window to face his old friend directly, "that Christopher Ashford is only now beginning to understand the full implications of his actions. In the moment of committing the murder, he believed himself to be securing his future and validating his worth. Now, he is beginning to comprehend that he has instead consigned himself to a future in which his worth will be eternally defined by the single moment in which he chose to poison his father rather than accept his father's apparent preference for a manifestly inferior rival." Hutchins rose from his desk and extended his hand to Wimsey in a gesture that encompassed both gratitude and the peculiar bond that forms between men who have collaborated in the exposure of human depravity. "Thank you, Wimsey. I confess that this case would have proceeded in an entirely different direction without your intervention. The surface narrative, Edmund's attempted murder, his presence in the kitchen with the poison, would have been accepted as sufficient explanation for the crime. Christopher would have succumbed, Ed his inheritance, and lived in the knowledge that his brother had been executed for his crime. A sobering thought, Wimsey acknowledged, accepting the handshake with genuine warmth. Which is why the pursuit of truth, however troubling that truth may ultimately prove to be, remains paramount. Justice, imperfect though it may be, requires that we at least attempt to discern the actual sequence of events rather than accepting the most convenient narrative. Shall I depart for London on the morning train, or does your investigation require my continued presence? "I believe you've earned your liberty," Hutchins replied. "The remainder of the matter falls squarely within the domain of the legal authorities, though I suspect that neither Edmund nor Christopher will find much comfort in whatever judgment the courts ultimately render." The morning light that filtered through the windows of Whimsy's first-class compartment on the London-bound express possessed that particular quality of November illumination, pale, somewhat anemic, yet possessed of a certain clarity that rendered all details with almost painful distinctness. He had settled himself with a copy of the Times and a rather superior cup of coffee procured from the dining car, and was in the process of contemplating an article regarding parliamentary inefficiency when the compartment door slid open to admit a figure that caused him to lower his newspaper with considerable interest. Edmund Ashford stood in the doorway, his appearance suggesting that the intervening hours since his brother's arrest had done nothing to ameliorate his psychological distress. His face remained drawn, his eyes rimmed with the particular exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights spent in contemplation of one's own culpability. He held a small leather case in one hand, and his expression suggested a man who had come to a decision of company, an considerable moment, and was only now beginning to question the wisdom of that decision. "Lord Peter," Edmund said, his voice carrying the quality of a man uncertain of his reception. "Forgive the intrusion. I observed you boarding the train and felt compelled to speak with you before you departed Sussex entirely." Whimsy gestured toward the seat opposite, an invitation that Edmund accepted with evident gratitude, settling himself with the careful movements of someone whose bones had begun to rebel against the demands placed upon them. "I confess I'm surprised to find you at liberty," Whimsy observed pleasantly. "I had rather assumed that the constabulary would have insisted upon maintaining your proximity, pending the formal initiation of charges." "They did attempt to prevent my departure," Edmund acknowledged, "but my solicitor argued, with some success, that there existed no formal charges sufficient to justify detention pending trial. The Crown Prosecutor has indicated his intention to proceed, but the paperwork has not yet been completed. I found myself possessed of a brief window of opportunity, and I felt it incumbent upon me to utilize that window to speak with you regarding certain matters that have been troubling my conscience." Whimsy closed his newspaper with deliberate care and gave Edmund his full attention, recognizing in the younger man's demeanor the particular quality of confession deferred, but ultimately unavoidable. "Proceed," he invited. "I suspect there are details regarding your attempted murder that have not yet been fully articulated to the constabulary." Edmund's fingers worked at the clasp of his leather case with an agitation that suggested considerable internal struggle. When he finally spoke, his voice had acquired a tremulous quality that belied the careful enunciation he was attempting to maintain. "I lied to Superintendent Hutchins Regardy. The precise moment at which I renounced my intention to poison my father. I told him that I abandoned the plan while still in the kitchen, that I replaced the bent spoon in the drawer and departed without completing the act. That was not, in fact, the precise sequence of events." "Illuminate me," Whimsy requested, his tone suggesting neither judgment nor surprise, merely an interest in the accurate establishment of chronological fact. "I did not renounce the plan in the kitchen," Edmund continued, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic clacking of the train's wheels against the track. "I carried the bent spoon with me. I intended to administer the poison directly, to watch my father consume the poisoned tea and feel the satisfaction of knowing that I had finally taken control of my own destiny. But when I approached the study door, this would have been perhaps 20 minutes after the tea had been delivered, I heard my father speaking. He was on the telephone, conducting a conversation with his solicitor regarding his will." Edmund paused, and when he resumed speaking, the words came in a rush, as though he were attempting to expel them before his nerve could fail him entirely. He was discussing the possibility of altering his will yet again, of returning it to its original state in my favor. He said that he had been unfair in his assessment of Christopher's character, that he had been blinded by Christopher's apparent success and had failed to recognize that success achieved through such rigorous self-denial and emotional suppression was not in fact success at all. He said that Edmund, that is, he said that I, had at least retained the capacity for genuine feeling, for authentic human connection. Even if I had failed to translate those capacities into conventional achievement, Whimsy remained entirely motionless as Edmund's confession continued, understanding. With sudden and crystalline clarity, the precise nature of the younger man's psychological torment. The bent spoon, which Edmund had presumably carried with him, had become something other than an instrument of murder. It had become a symbol of renunciation rendered unnecessary by the very paternal validation Edmund had so desperately sought. "I stood outside that study door," Edmund said, his voice now barely above a whisper, with the poison in my hand, listening to my father speak words that would have transformed my entire existence had I heard them prior to my descent into this abyss. And I understood, in that moment, that he had always loved me, that his apparent coldness had been not rejection but disappointment, the disappointment of a father who loved his son sufficiently to demand that son's highest achievement, not merely his contentment. "What did you do?" Whimsy asked gently. "I threw the bent spoon into the shrubbery outside the study window. I returned to my room and attempted to consume sufficient quantities of alcohol to render myself unconscious. And I waited for morning with the knowledge that I had been saved from an act of irrevocable destruction by a circumstance entirely beyond my control or comprehension. My father was poisoned by my brother using the instrument I had prepared, and the law will almost certainly conclude that I bear primary responsibility for his death, as indeed I must. I prepared the mechanism. I selected the means. I renounced only at the final moment, and that renunciation was occasioned not by moral triumph, but by the simple accident of my father's words reaching my ears." Whimsy regarded Edmund with an expression of profound and almost melancholic understanding. "You believe yourself to be profoundly complicit in your father's death." "I know myself to be so," Edmund replied, "which is why I've come to you. I've brought tea." He bent spoon. "I retrieved it from the shrubbery this morning. I'm returning to the constabulary to provide them with a complete and accurate account of the evening's events. I will not permit my brother to be the sole bearer of responsibility for an act that was, in its essential conception, my own." Whimsy accepted the leather case, understanding that Edmund had come not to confess to Whimsy, but to perform the act of confession before a witness who would understand its true significance. "That," Whimsy said quietly, "is undoubtedly the correct course. The law may ultimately be merciful or merciless, but it can only function upon the basis of truth. Go back to the constabulary. Tell them everything. And perhaps, merely perhaps, they will recognize in your confession a transformation of character that suggests the possibility of redemption." As Edmund departed the compartment and the train continued its inexorable journey toward London, Whimsy gazed out at the Sussex landscape sliding past the window and contemplated the curious mechanism by which human beings might simultaneously possess both the capacity for evil and the capacity for renunciation of that evil. The bent spoon, resting in his hands, seemed to embody that paradox, an instrument of death that had ultimately become an instrument of confession, a symbol of intention abandoned but never entirely transcended. He placed the case carefully on the seat beside him and returned his attention to his newspaper, though his eyes registered the words without truly absorbing their meaning. Some truths, he reflected, were too profound for the mere consumption of morning journalism to adequately address.